So you bought a new mountain bike online. Let's walk through how to build it up and get it ready to ride. I'll be demonstrating with my new Transition Spur, but this process is going to be pretty much the same for any mountain bike that's been shipped to you. But first, here's what you need. At a bare minimum, you'll need some metric Allen or hex wrenches, a torque wrench, a bike pump, and a shock pump. If you want to set your tires up tubeless, you'll also need tubeless sealant, tubeless valves, some way to remove a valve core, and a tire lever or two. You may also want to have grease, and I like to use anti-seize in spots like the pedals that you might not touch for a long time and then want to remove later. Having some staging tools like a bike stand and a trash can for working on wheels can make life easier too. The first step is just to take everything out of the box. One or both wheels will probably be packaged separately. Set those aside for now and get the bike up on a bike stand. Always clamp bikes by the seat post, never clamp the carbon frame. If you don't have a bike stand, bikes typically ship with a plastic attachment on the front axle that helps them stand inside the box, so you can use that to stand them up somewhere. Your handlebars are probably just dangling, so the first step is to attach them. Unscrew the bolts on the front of the stem using a regular hex wrench. Torque wrenches should only be used for tightening bolts, never loosening. When you've got the front of the stem off, insert the handlebars and then tighten the stem back down. Try to make sure the bars are properly centered and angled the way that you want, but don't worry too much as you can and probably will readjust this later. When you've got it how you want it, torque the bolts to spec, which is usually going to be between 4 and 6 Newton meters. But for the record, anytime I say torque to spec, that means the correct spec for the specific part that you're dealing with. Often torque specs are written right on the part to make it easy, but they should also be in your manual or on the manufacturer's website. If you do have to look them up, I'd suggest writing them down because you'll need them again in the future anytime you make adjustments or swap out parts. You can also torque the bolts that hold the stem to the fork, assuming the stem is on straight. Your wheels probably came with tubes in them, so if you want to run tubes, you can pop the wheels on now. If you want to run tubeless, don't worry, we're going to cover that in a minute. I like to put high-performance grease on the axles, although it probably doesn't matter. Wheels often come with a plastic protector disc inserted into the axle, which you just pop right out. Insert the wheel into the fork, making note of the brake disc, which has to fit between the pads in the brake caliper. When you've got it in correctly, the axle will slide right in, and you can torque it to spec or tighten it down if it has a quick release. Now I'm going to remove both wheels so we can set them up tubeless. First, shift into the lowest gear. Then pull down on the derailleur. There should be a handy button somewhere around here on most derailleurs that helps keep the chain slack. With the chain slack, we can remove the rear axle and pop the wheel out.
Oh shit.
For setting up tires, having a regular sized trash can like this is really helpful. We'll set the wheel down on top of it and then let all the air out of the tubes by unscrewing the top of the Presta valve and pressing down. When the air is out, work around the tire with your hands, pushing one side of it further into the rim. Then, with your hands, a tire lever, or anything that isn't going to scratch your rim or your rim tape, reach in and lever a small section of the tire to the outside of the rim. Push this around so that one side of the tire is completely off of the rim, and now you can unscrew the Presta valve retainer and pull the tube out. Technically, there might be another step here, which is applying rim tape to your rim. But these days, almost any mountain bike rim is going to come pre-taped, so you can almost certainly skip that step, and that's what we're going to do here. The next step is to insert the tubeless valves into the rim. Some valves come with different rubber shapes for different rim types, so if you have a choice, go with whatever fits best. Once it's in, screw down the nut that holds it tightly in place, but just hand tighten. Don't go crazy here or you could damage the valve or the rim. Now, there are various ways to go from here, but I'll show you the way that I prefer. The first step is to reseat the tire, so we're going to work back around, pulling the side that was out back into the rim. Note that this step is not always as easy as it looks here. I'm doing this with a relatively thin trail tire. If you're doing this with a thicker enduro or downhill casing, this step can be much harder, and at least one tire lever, if not more, will probably be required. Make sure the valve is sitting between the two sides of the tire. Mine wasn't here, so you can see I'm quickly popping the top side of the tire over the valve with a tire lever. Now we're going to fill the tire with air to seat it. I have this blue air shot tank which allows me to pump in a large amount of air all at once. But you can generally just do this by pumping really fast with a hand pump, or if you have one you can use an air compressor. Just be careful not to exceed the maximum pressure that the tire allows. When I'm setting a tire up like this, I typically aim for 30 to 40 psi. Now, you might have to do this more than once to get the tire properly seated, which you'll know by looking for this little line that goes around just outside the rim. If that's visible and it looks aligned correctly on both sides all the way around, you're good to go. Now that the tire's seated, we'll add the tire sealant. This can be a little messy, so it's a good idea to put down some newspaper or a shop towel or something. If you haven't already, remove the valve core. It can be screwed in and out with a little tool, and many tubeless valves come with caps that can double as core removal tools. Then, put the recommended amount of sealant into the tire through the now open valve. Once it's in, reinsert the valve core and then inflate the tire to whatever your normal preferred pressure would be. Then, shake the tire around like a lunatic to ensure that the sealant gets all around the tire and seals it in place. Congratulations, you've gone tubeless. Now it's time to put the rear wheel back on, or on for the first time if it didn't ship installed on the bike. If that's the case, you may also need to attach your derailleur first. The trick there is to look for this little notch in the derailleur hanger, but I made a video about building up a YT Jeffsy that goes into more detail on this, so if your bike came without the derailleur hanger installed, you may want to give that a watch. Insert the wheel into the frame, again making sure to guide the brake disc in between the pads in the caliper, and laying the chain over the gears on the cassette. Insert the axle, torque it to spec, release that button on the derailleur to retension the chain, and you should be good to go. And of course you'll have to reinsert the front wheel as well. Now it's time for pedals. The trick here is that the pedals and the cranks themselves have a specific side. These say R and L, right and left, but it's probably easier to think of it as drive side, or right, and non-drive side, which is left. On the drive side, and that's the side where the drivetrain is, pedals screw in normally, righty-tighty or clockwise. You may be inserting an Allen wrench from the back end of the crank to tighten the pedal, but if you think about the pedal's axle turning clockwise from your perspective looking at the crank from the outside just like I am here, you'll be doing it right. So on the drive side, righty-tighty with the pedal axle. On the non-drive side, it's the opposite. Think about the pedal axle turning left or counterclockwise as you screw it in from your perspective on the outside of the crank as I am here. If you screw a pedal in wrong, you could strip out the cranks and you'd need new ones, so definitely be sure that you're going the right way before you apply a lot of pressure. At this point, you're pretty much good to go, but there are a few other things you should probably do. Bike chains tend to ship with a really sticky grease. You probably will want to clean that off with a drivetrain cleaner and then apply your chain lube of choice, as I'm pretending to do here because I did this step without actually filming it. If your bike has suspension, you'll also want to set that up for your weight. The process for this is going to vary by suspension brand, model, and type, but for most air shocks and forks, it involves screwing off the air valve cap here and then using a shock pump to pump in air. Most shocks and forks also come with these little rings, so for example, if your bike manufacturer recommends 25% sag on your shock, you want to set it up with enough air that the bike pushes this ring about 25% of the way down if you sit on it gently without pedaling. Before you go out for a ride, you probably want to give the bike a once-over with a torque wrench too, just to ensure that all the bolts are torqued to spec. Now it should come torqued correctly from the factory, but that doesn't mean that it did, so it's best to double check. I generally also try to do a torque check like this about once a month, or anytime I'm hearing a noise like a squeak coming from the bike. Finally, you'll want to bed in your brakes. The weather here is too crappy for me to do that right now, but basically this means take your bike outside, pedal it around for a while, and pull gently on the brakes to slow it down to a near crawl without stopping. And then speed up again, and repeat that process for about 10 minutes. The goal is just to get a good even coating of the brake pad material across the surface of the brake disc, as this will maximize your stopping power.